In a remote African village surrounded by lush greenery and ancient traditions, the air was thick with the aroma of incense and the hum of traditional wedding songs. Nya sat rigidly in her bridal attire, her face a mask of forced composure as the villagers bustled around in preparation for her marriage to Abasi, a man she barely knew. She had always been a fiercely independent young woman, her heart set on escaping the confines of village life to pursue her dreams in the bustling city. Yet here she was, draped in ceremonial cloth, about to marry a man she neither loved nor chose. Her parents, the pillars of tradition in the community, had insisted on the match. Their family was drowning in debt, and Abasi, though a poor farmer, had somehow convinced them he was the solution to their troubles. He is humble, hard-working, and dependable, her father had argued, his voice carrying the weight of finality. Nya had protested vehemently, her voice breaking with frustration, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. "This is not about love," her mother had said sternly. "It's about survival. Abasi is your duty, not your choice." The wedding ceremony began as the village gathered under the sprawling branches of a sacred baobab tree. Abasi stood at the altar, his demeanor calm and reserved, his eyes betraying little emotion. He was a man of few words, known for his quiet nature and hard-working spirit. But there was an air of mystery about him that unsettled Nya. He was not unattractive, but his guarded demeanor and the strange way he avoided eye contact with anyone for too long only added to her unease. As the elders chanted blessings, an old woman, hunched with age and wrapped in faded cloth, shuffled through the crowd. Her milky eyes, clouded with years, seemed to pierce through Nya as she leaned in close and whispered in a raspy voice, "You have no idea who you're marrying." Nya stiffened, her heartbeat quickening. She turned to look at the woman, but she had already melted back into the crowd, leaving behind an inexplicable sense of foreboding. Nya shook her head, dismissing the woman's words as the ramblings of a senile elder, but the feeling of unease lingered. When the vows were exchanged, Nya spoke her words mechanically, her voice hollow. Abasi's response was steady but lacked warmth, as if he too were fulfilling an obligation rather than celebrating a union. As the ceremony concluded and the villagers cheered, Nya felt the weight of her new reality settle heavily on her shoulders. She was now bound to a man she didn't trust, in a life she didn't want. That night, as they entered Abasi's modest home at the edge of the village, Nya couldn't shake the feeling that her life had taken a dark and irreversible turn. The old woman's words echoed in her mind, a chilling reminder that this was only the beginning of something far more sinister than she could imagine. After their wedding, Nya moved into Abasi's modest hut on the outskirts of the village, a simple dwelling that seemed to mirror the life they were now trapped in. The small house was surrounded by thick trees, and the isolation only deepened Nia's sense of loneliness. Her dreams of a bustling city life seemed more distant with every passing day. Life with Abasi was far from the escape she had imagined. The hut was humble, with its thatched roof sagging slightly under the weight of years, but it was all Abasi could afford. He worked tirelessly in the fields, tending to crops that barely yielded enough to feed them. His back was always bent with hard labor, and despite his relentless efforts, the money they earned was scarce. Nya's frustration began to mount as she realized how limited their future together would be. Abasi's humble nature, once appealing, now grated on her. Every day felt like a reminder of how trapped she was. She resented him for his inability to provide more, for his quiet acceptance of their poverty. He never seemed to ask for more, never seemed to want more. It gnawed at Nya's spirit, her bitterness growing with each passing day. Despite their struggles, it was Abasi's behavior that became the true source of Nya's anxiety. She started noticing his peculiar habits that made her question everything she thought she knew about him. Every night, he would lock a particular chest in the corner of their small bedroom, a chest that seemed out of place in such a modest home. Nya's curiosity grew as she noticed the routine. The chest was always locked with a heavy padlock, and Abasi never allowed anyone near it, not even her. There was something obsessive about the way he handled it, as though it was the most important thing in the house. Even more unsettling was his behavior after dark. Abasi would disappear for hours, always returning just before dawn, covered in mud and grime. His face was always pale, his eyes haunted as if he had seen something terrifying. He would refuse to answer her questions, muttering vague excuses about working late or needing fresh air. But Naya knew something was wrong. The more she pressed him, the more closed off he became, retreating into silence or changing the subject. It was as if he were hiding something much larger than just his poverty. One afternoon, while cleaning the house, Nia stumbled across something that confirmed her growing suspicion. In a hidden drawer, behind a stack of old clothes, she found several tattered letters, yellowed with age. The handwriting was frantic, filled with fear, and the letters were addressed to someone named Amina, a name that haunted her. They seemed to be from a woman, desperately trying to warn someone about a terrible fate. But the messages were incomplete and fragmented. Each letter ended with a chilling line: "The curse of the forgotten is real." The discovery made Naya's heart race. She couldn't shake the sense that there was something far more sinister happening in this home. The more she looked around, the more strange things she found. Cryptic symbols were carved into the wooden beams of the house, symbols she didn't recognize, but that felt deeply unsettling. It was as though Abasi had deliberately etched them there, perhaps as a form of protection, or maybe a sign of something darker. The tension in the house grew palpable. At night, Nia began hearing whispers in the dark, soft murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere. She would lie awake, her body frozen with fear, certain that someone, or something, was watching her. The village, once a familiar and comforting place, now seemed eerie and unfamiliar. One day, while talking to a neighbor, Naya was warned about the chest. "Stay away from Abasi's chest," the old woman said, her voice shaking with fear. "It's the curse of the forgotten. If you want peace, leave it alone." The words sent a chill through Naya. What was Abasi hiding? What had he done? And what was he trying to protect her from? Her unease grew, and the sense that she was living in the shadow of something terrible took root. As each day passed, Nia felt more like a prisoner in her own home, trapped in a life she didn't choose, with a husband who seemed to hold a dark secret. Nia's growing unease reached a boiling point one afternoon when she discovered something that could no longer be ignored. While cleaning under the bed, a corner of something soft caught her attention. Pulling it out, her heart skipped a beat. It was a blood-stained cloth, dark red and crusted with old stains, tucked away as if hidden on purpose. The cloth reeked of death, and its presence sent an icy wave of dread coursing through her veins. It didn't take much to connect the dots. The blood was fresh, and it clearly wasn't from a simple injury. Naya's mind raced, wondering what kind of twisted secret her husband was hiding. Shaking, she confronted Abasi, demanding to know where the cloth came from and what it meant. His response was chilling in its coldness. He avoided her gaze and his voice trembled ever so slightly. "Some things are better left unknown," he said, his words hanging in the air like a warning. The finality in his tone only intensified Naya's suspicions. The more he withdrew from her questions, the more desperate she became for answers. She knew there was something darker at play, something that involved far more than just their struggling marriage. Abasi's cryptic behavior was no longer something she could dismiss as odd or insignificant. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Nia made up her mind. If Abasi wasn't going to tell her the truth, then she would uncover it herself. That night, she waited until the house was quiet, the village sounds fading into the night. When she was certain Abasi was preparing to leave, she silently followed him. Her heart raced as she crept behind him, careful not to alert him to her presence. Abasi, lantern in hand and a shovel slung over his shoulder, walked steadily toward the edge of the village. Naya's breath caught in her throat as she saw him move toward the dark, dense forest that bordered their home. The night was thick with silence, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Naya kept her distance, but never lost sight of him. She watched as he disappeared into the forest, his figure barely visible in the darkness. What was he doing with the shovel? What could possibly require him to venture out alone in the middle of the night, with only a dim lantern to guide his way? She waited for what felt like an eternity, the fear of being caught gnawing at her as she crouched low to the ground. Eventually, Abasi returned, the lantern's light flickering as he made his way back to their hut. His movements were slower now, deliberate, as though he had just finished something. Naya noticed the dirt on his boots, freshly caked in mud, but he did not acknowledge it. He was careful, as though trying to avoid drawing attention to his actions. The unease in Naya's chest deepened. What had he buried, and why had he gone to such lengths to keep it a secret? The next morning, when Abasi had gone to work in the fields, Naya inspected the area near the forest. There was no sign of anything unusual. No fresh markings, no disturbed earth. But the dirt on his boots still weighed heavily on her mind. She couldn't shake the images of him walking back from the forest, his expression unreadable, his boots caked in soil that clearly hadn't come from the village grounds. Despite her fear, Naya couldn't stop herself from delving deeper. She knew she couldn't keep pretending everything was normal. Abasi was hiding something, and the longer she waited, the more she feared she'd lose her chance to uncover the truth. The secret was unraveling, slowly but surely, and Nia was determined to follow it to the bitter end, no matter where it led. Nia's determination to uncover the truth about her husband reached a fever pitch. Every day she wrestled with the suspicion that something far darker was hidden within their home. But there was one thing she hadn't dared to confront: the locked chest. Abasi's strange attachment to it, his obsessive ritual of locking it every night, had kept her at bay. But now, with her heart pounding and her mind clouded with questions, Nia decided it was time to act. One afternoon, when Abasi left for the fields, she knew she had a fleeting window of opportunity. She wasted no time. She grabbed a heavy iron tool from the kitchen, her hands shaking with a mix of fear and excitement. The chest was heavy, its ancient wood worn with age, but the lock was old too. With a sharp twist, Nia managed to break the lock. The sound of the metal snapping felt deafening in the silence of the hut. Her breath caught in her throat as the lid creaked open. Inside, Naya was confronted with a shocking sight. Wrapped in soft, luxurious silk cloth were several gold coins, gleaming in the dim light. The coins were heavy and unmistakable in their richness, their luster a stark contradiction to Abasi's constant claims of poverty. Naya's heart raced as she ran her fingers over them, feeling the weight of the secret Abasi had been hiding. Where had he gotten this gold? Why hadn't he mentioned it, especially when they were struggling so much? But that was not all. Beneath the coins, hidden within the folds of the silk, was a photograph. Naya's breath caught as she saw the image. A younger Abasi, smiling, standing next to a beautiful woman. They were holding hands, gazing at each other with an intimacy that was foreign to Naya. The woman's smile was warm and genuine, and she appeared to be someone who held a deep connection with Abasi. The photograph was dated 5 years ago, and at the bottom, in messy handwriting, was a name: my beloved Amina. Amina. The name sent a chill down Naya's spine. Who was she? The name felt like a knife twisting in her gut. Why had Abasi never spoken of her? And why had he kept this photograph, hidden away for all this time? But the discovery didn't end there. Wrapped in a tattered scarf, tucked beneath the photograph, was something even more chilling: a bloodied knife. The blade was jagged and stained with what appeared to be dried blood. It was old, the blood nearly black, but the sight of it made Naya's stomach churn. What kind of secret life was Abasi leading? The presence of the knife, so carefully hidden with the rest of the items, made her wonder if it was tied to something far darker than she could imagine. Naya felt her world crashing down around her. The gold, the photograph, and the knife were pieces of a puzzle she wasn't ready to solve, but she had no choice but to face it. Her mind swirled with 1,000 questions. Who was Amina? What had happened to her? And why had Abasi kept all of this from her? The bloodstained knife suggested violence, and the photograph hinted at a past that Abasi had clearly tried to bury. As she sat there, trembling, clutching the photograph in her hands, Naya realized that the man she had married was not the person she thought he was. The life they were building together was built on lies, and she had only scratched the surface of the dark secrets that lay beneath. Fear, confusion, and horror consumed her as she realized that Abasi's hidden past was about to come crashing into their present. The truth, whatever it was, would soon come to light, and Nia wasn't sure if she was ready for what she would uncover. When Abasi returned from the fields that evening, Nia could feel the weight of the confrontation hanging in the air. She had uncovered the truth, or at least part of it, and now it was time to force him to face the lies he had been living. Her hands trembled as she clutched the photograph and the blood-stained knife, the items still heavy with the dread they had caused her. She couldn't let this go any longer. She couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. As soon as Abasi stepped into the hut, she didn't give him a chance to speak. "I know what you've been hiding," Naya said, her voice shaking but resolute. "I know about Amina, the gold, and the knife." Her words felt like daggers, each one piercing deeper into the wall of silence Abasi had built around himself. Abasi froze, his face going pale, as he realized there was no escaping the truth anymore. He stood there for a long moment, his shoulders slumped in defeat, before he finally spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't have seen that." His eyes avoided hers, filled with a mixture of guilt, fear, and a deep sorrow. Nia's anger flared. "Tell me what's going on, Abasi. Who is Amina? Why are you hiding this from me? What kind of man are you?" Her voice cracked with emotion, the frustration and fear rising within her. She demanded the truth, wanting to know how she could have married a man with such dark secrets. Finally, Abasi sank to his knees, tears welling up in his eyes. "I never wanted you to find out like this," he said, his voice thick with regret. "But the truth is I am cursed. Amina's spirit won't leave me in peace. I killed her, Naya. I killed her in a fit of rage." The words hit Naya like a slap, and she staggered back, her heart pounding in her chest. "You killed her?" Her voice was barely audible as the shock set in. The man she had married, the man who seemed so gentle, had murdered his wife. Abasi nodded, his eyes filled with pain. "I loved her so much, but I found out she betrayed me. She was unfaithful, and in a moment of blind rage, I killed her. I didn't mean to, but it happened. And after she died, I realized what I had done. But it was too late." His voice trembled as he continued, the weight of the confession crushing him. "Amina's family gave me the gold as a gift, and I thought it would bring me peace. But nothing worked. Amina's spirit has haunted me ever since, tormenting me for what I did." Nia's mind was reeling, struggling to process the horrific revelation. She didn't know what to say, how to respond. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body was frozen in place as she tried to absorb the enormity of what Abasi had just confessed. The gold, the knife, the chest. Nia's voice trembled. "They're all connected to her." "Yes," Abasi whispered. "The gold belonged to Amina's family, and I kept it hidden, hoping it would bring me some form of redemption. But the knife is the one I used to kill her. It's the symbol of my guilt. And the chest is where I've been trying to keep the evil away, where I've tried to lock away my sins. But nothing works, Naya. Nothing." Naya's eyes filled with tears, Not just for herself, but for the woman she never knew, the woman whose life had been tragically cut short. What do you mean, the curse? What happens to me now? Abasi's eyes were filled with unspeakable pain. The curse, he explained, is that anyone who marries me will suffer the same fate as Amina unless the curse is lifted. You will be haunted, tormented, and eventually you will die, just like she did. Amina's spirit won't stop until she has her revenge on me and anyone close to me. You're trapped, Naya, just like I am. The room felt suffocating as the weight of his words sank in. Naya's heart raced as she realized the horror of what she was involved in. She wasn't just married to a man with a secret past. She had unwittingly married a man cursed by the vengeful spirit of his dead wife. Abasi's tears fell freely now, his entire body trembling with remorse. There must be something we can do, Naya whispered, her voice barely audible, as the crushing reality of her situation set in. She had entered a nightmare she couldn't escape. Naya's world had shattered into pieces, each fragment reflecting a horrifying reality she had never imagined. After the confrontation with Abasi, she couldn't shake the weight of the truth that had been revealed. The love she had once felt for her husband had crumbled, replaced by disgust and fear. The man she had married, the man she had trusted, was a killer, a man whose secrets had been buried so deeply that she couldn't have ever imagined them. And now, the curse that bound him to his past threatened to destroy her as well. Devastated and broken, Naya made a decision. She could no longer stay in the village, not with Abasi, not with the constant fear and unease gnawing at her soul. She packed her belongings in the dead of night, determined to leave the nightmare behind and find a new life away from the haunting memories. She had to escape. There was no other choice. But as she prepared to leave, the very air seemed to conspire against her. The village, once familiar and comforting, felt oppressive. Her every step was followed by whispers, and strange occurrences began to escalate. At night, Naya would wake in a cold sweat, her heart pounding in her chest, to see the reflection of a pale, sorrowful woman in the mirror. A woman she knew could not be real. The spectre of Amina appeared in the glass, her eyes filled with an indescribable sadness and rage. Nia would turn away in terror, only to find that the apparition would disappear, leaving behind a lingering chill. Sleep became impossible as the dreams began. In them, Amina would appear, standing in the distance, her face obscured by shadows, her mouth open in a silent scream. Nia could hear her voice, faint but unmistakable, whispering in the darkness, "You've been living with a murderer." Each night, the dreams grew more vivid, more disturbing, until Nia could no longer distinguish between waking and sleeping. The visions of Amina's ghost haunted her every moment, a constant reminder of the truth that she had tried so hard to avoid. One fateful night, as Nia lay awake in bed, the air in the room grew colder, the oppressive silence thick with tension. And then, in the corner of the room, Amina's ghost materialized before her, a pale, sorrowful figure draped in the same tattered clothes Naya had seen in the photograph. The apparition's eyes bore into Naya's soul, filled with an intense, unearthly grief. Amina's voice rang out clear and sharp, cutting through the silence. "You don't know the full truth, do you?" Naya's heart skipped a beat, her throat closing as she tried to speak, but no words came. Amina stepped closer, her ghostly presence filling the room, and Naya could feel the weight of her sorrow pressing down on her. Amina spoke again, her voice low and filled with anger. "Abasi didn't kill me out of rage, out of some foolish jealousy. He killed me because he wanted my family's wealth. He killed me to steal the gold that belonged to my people." Naya's breath caught in her throat as the revelation hit her like a blow to the chest. Amina's words tore through the lie that Abasi had told her. The love story she had believed was shattered, and in its place was the brutal truth of betrayal and greed. Abasi had killed his wife, not because of anger or heartbreak, but because he had wanted to possess the very thing that had kept her family alive for generations. The gold had been his prize, his reward for taking Amina's life, and he had manipulated the entire story, convincing Naya that he was a victim of his own actions. Amina's eyes burned with fury, and her voice became sharp and cutting. He killed me because I stood in the way of his desire for power. And now, Naya, you're paying the price for his sins. You will suffer the same fate as me unless you break the curse he's cast upon you. Naya felt a chill wash over her as the realization sunk in. She had been living with a murderer, a man who had manipulated her from the very beginning. Abbasi's lies had woven a web around her, and she had been trapped, caught in his deceit. Amina's ghost faded, leaving Nia alone in the room, trembling with fear and rage. The truth had been revealed, but it only led to more questions, more uncertainty. Nia's escape seemed impossible now, the curse too powerful to break, and Abbasi's hold over her life felt suffocating. She had been deceived, and now she had to face the terrifying consequences of her decision to marry him. Amina's warning echoed in her ears. You will suffer the same fate. As Naya sat in the darkened room, the weight of the ghost's words crushing her, she realized that the only way to break free from this nightmare would be to confront Abbasi once again, and this time there would be no more lies, only the brutal, painful truth. Nia knew she couldn't stay any longer, not in this village, not with Abbasi. The realization that her husband was not only a murderer, but a man who had manipulated her life, filling it with lies and darkness, was the breaking point. She had to expose him. She had to make the village see the truth of who Abbasi really was. The weight of Amina's curse was too much for her to bear, and Naya knew there would be no peace for her until she did something drastic. Her plan was simple. She would gather the villagers, tell them everything, and make sure Abbasi couldn't escape the consequences of his actions. She packed her belongings in haste, ready to leave the hut and run to the village square. Her heart pounded in her chest as she imagined the confrontation that would follow. But there was no turning back now. As she crept out of the hut, the heavy door creaking behind her, Naya's thoughts were filled with nothing but the need to run, to get to the villagers before Abbasi could stop her. She had just reached the edge of the village when she heard a voice calling her name, a low, deep voice that froze her in place. It was Abbasi. He had caught her. You're leaving me, Nya. His voice held a dangerous edge, and as she turned, she saw him standing there, his figure barely visible in the fading light of evening. He looked like a different man, angry, desperate, and filled with a dark resolve. His eyes, once filled with love, now burned with fury. Abbasi, I'm leaving you, Nia said, her voice trembling but firm. I'm telling the villagers the truth. They deserve to know what you've done. Abbasi's face twisted with rage. You don't understand, do you? He spat. You think you can leave? You think you can expose me without paying the price? I'll never let you go. Before Naya could react, Abbasi lunged at her. The speed of his movement took her by surprise, and she stumbled back, her heart racing. She could see in his eyes that he was no longer the man she had married, but something darker, more dangerous. She knew now that there would be no talking, no pleading. She had to defend herself. In a frantic blur of motion, Naya's hand grasped the bloodied knife from the chest she had found earlier. It felt cold in her hand, its weight a grim reminder of the terrible truth that had been unveiled. She had never imagined using it for anything more than to understand the horrors hidden in her marriage. But now, it was her only means of survival. As Abbasi closed the distance between them, his hands reaching for her throat, Nia's instincts kicked in. She plunged the knife into his side with a force fueled by fear and anger. The impact was sharp and immediate, and Abbasi let out a strangled cry. He staggered back, his hand clutching his wound, but his eyes never left Nia. He looked betrayed, furious, But there was no time for sympathy. He had forced her into this position. Abasi collapsed to his knees, his blood staining the earth beneath him. Nia stepped back, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she watched him bleed out. The reality of what she had just done hit her like a wave, and she felt both numb and sickened by the violent turn her life had taken. But there was no time to dwell on it. Abasi was still alive, though barely, and his final words echoed in the still night. You will never escape me," he muttered, his voice weak but filled with a venomous finality. "Amina's spirit will haunt you forever. You'll pay for what you've done. She will never let you go." His body slumped to the ground, his breath stilled. But the weight of his curse hung heavily in the air, thick with the promise of the horrors to come. Nia stood frozen, the knife still gripped in her hand, her body trembling with fear, guilt, and the overwhelming weight of the situation. The next morning, the villagers found her standing in the clearing by the hut, still holding the knife. She was surrounded by gold coins she hadn't touched, but that were now scattered across the ground. The sight was impossible to ignore. The villagers gasped as they took in the scene. Nia standing over Abasi's lifeless body, a bloodied knife in her hand, and the gold glistening in the morning light. They immediately assumed the worst. Whispers spread like wildfire, and the villagers believed the curse had taken hold. They thought Nia had killed Abasi in cold blood, driven by greed or revenge. The presence of the gold only added to the suspicion, and Nia was dragged back to the village, her fate sealed by the very curse she had tried to escape. In that moment, Nia realized that she was trapped, both by the villagers' beliefs and by the curse that Abasi had unleashed upon her. Amina's spirit, the ghostly presence she had tried to flee from, would follow her, and she would never truly be free. But one thing was certain: Nia had taken the first step toward breaking free from Abasi's grip. The road ahead would be filled with darkness and uncertainty, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she had a chance to take control of her own fate. But as she was led away, the whisper of Amina's voice, filled with sorrow and wrath, was the only thing she could hear.